Thank you, Christy. That was a lot of scripture today. And mostly we did the first part, so Rachel, I hope you're not too disappointed. Mostly we did the first part so that we remember who Zechariah is, to lead us into the second part about this prophecy. So, my friends, it is my prayer that today our faith vision will be adjusted so that we can see and live into the already, not yet of our faith. Okay, so today we're going to travel back in time. We always do when we do Bible study and preaching from the Bible, but we're traveling back in time from where we were last week because today we're getting the backstory about John the Baptist. You might remember last week he was out exhorting and encouraging people in the wilderness, baptizing them and guiding them in how to live into the fulfilled promises of God here and now. Regular people and soldiers and tax collectors were all showing up in the wilderness to hear John at the river and to be baptized. And so this week we learn a little bit more about John in his very early days. Because John himself, he's out preaching the fulfillment of God, right? He's out in the wilderness preaching, but in his birth, he himself, it seems, is the fulfillment of God's promises in Zechariah and Elizabeth's lives. Because Zechariah and Elizabeth are old, and they have lived righteous before God. They're old. My mom and dad are here today, but they probably were older than you guys, right? But they were old and had lived righteously before God, right? It says following blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of their faith. And still, they have heartache and pain because they don't have children of their own. And even as they're living faithfully with God, their story is not unique in their larger faith story, right? Because you might remember another old couple who didn't have children of their own, Abraham and Sarah, right? And God promised to them that your descendants would be as numerous as the stars, as plentiful as the dust of the earth. Holy Hannah, that's a lot, right? Speaking of Hannah, I'm going to talk about her in just a moment here, right? And yet, as old people, Abraham and Sarah did not have children. And I just have to say, I didn't write this down, but I'm going to say, if you don't have children, it doesn't mean your life isn't full. It just means for these people, they felt this emptiness. There was something missing for them, right? And so Abraham and Sarah have been promised numerous descendants, and they're old, and they have no children of their own. And then Sarah does finally get pregnant when she is beyond the way of women, right? So she's an old woman and finally gets pregnant. She's old. I mean, like, well, yeah. In the Bible, she is an old woman, right? Or you maybe remember Hannah, who wasn't that old, but Hannah also didn't have children of her own, and she is found praying in the temple, weeping and begging to God for a child. And the priest in that story is pretty oblivious because the priest thinks that she's drunk and is like scolding her about this, right? And she's so distraught that she says, "No, I promise, should I have a child, I will bring that child into service in the temple." Hannah's child was named Samuel, and Samuel, like John, was called by God at a very early age. Right? So John is the fulfillment of hopes and dreams. He is the realization of an already not yet life that Elizabeth and Zechariah had been envisioning. And his life is soaked in blessings from before his beginning. These stories of others who waited for the Lord, and now this story of Zechariah and Elizabeth add add their own story to the ways that God fulfills God's promises. So this blessing that we heard that pours out from Zechariah has been brewing in him for more than 9 months, because he's mute from before the time that Elizabeth conceives until more than a week after John's birth. So Zechariah is a priest, knows the stories of their faith history, and he's had some time to reflect on what this new one coming into their life might mean. And at the circumcision ceremony, Zechariah blesses John. He is finally able to speak, and when he does, he recounts what God has done for God's people, and then he looks forward to what God will do through John. God will keep offering salvation. That is, God will keep delivering God's people from their enemies, rescuing them, allowing them to worship and to be closely connected to God. This is what God has done, it is what God is doing, and what God will continue to do. But still, Zechariah and Elizabeth are living in a time in the midst of Roman occupation, so they are actually surrounded by enemies, and they're not entirely free to live as they would choose. They had to be wise and strategic in how they express their faith. And still, in this blessing that Zechariah gives, we can see that he is living in the already not yet of faith. So wait, the what, the already not yet. I've said that a few times. And this is what we as people of faith see when we look at the world. We can see God's vision already realized, but not yet here. The already not yet keeps happening, and we can see glimpses of the amazing world that God promises. And still, sometimes it can be hard to recognize those things that happen in our more modern times. Like, we can look back at the Bible and say, well, that's great, it happened then, but does it really happen now? So, yes, it does. And this is an example that's happened in my own lifetime. And although it might sound like ancient history to some in this room, it's really not. So I wonder if you all remember anything about apartheid in South Africa, right? It was this system of racial segregation that was very strictly delineated, and it was in existence from 1948 until the early 1990s. And it was a system to ensure that the minority white population stayed in control politically, socially, and economically. And there was a specific order of importance for people. So the white minority were at the top, and then the Indian people were next. People called coloreds followed, and then black Africans. So there's very strict structure about order of importance of people. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu was a leader in the fight against apartheid, and he held several offices and important roles in South Africa. And Archbishop Tutu was a person who could see the already not yet. He could see God's vision for the world, even as they were enmeshed in the struggle to end apartheid and to realize salvation for people who were oppressed and not free because of their skin color and their placement within that system. So there's a story about one of the sermons that Archbishop Tutu gave during the most troubling times of apartheid in South Africa, because the government was shutting down anti-apartheid political rallies. And so Archbishop Tutu said, well, I guess we're going to have a worship service instead of a political rally. They had the worship service at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town, and it was attended by worshipers from all over South Africa. So lots of people were attracted to this worship service, including hundreds of police who came and surrounded the cathedral in a show of military force and intimidation. And as Tutu began preaching, then the police entered the cathedral, so they came into the sanctuary armed with guns, and they just lined the walls around the room. Some of them took out their notebooks to take notes about what he was saying. And yet he remained unintimidated and kept preaching. And at one point in his sermon, he turned to the police. He looked at them, I imagine, looked at them around the room, and he said, "You are powerful. You're very powerful. But you are not God's. And I serve a God who cannot be mocked. So since you've already lost, why don't you come and join the winning side?" Right? And immediately the congregation, and he's a different kind of preacher than me, right? So immediately the congregation were up dancing and shouting and singing in joy, right? Because Archbishop Tutu is pointing at this coming fulfillment of God's promises. And that coming fulfillment gives us courage to be the type of people who travel toward peace. It helps us to see the already, not yet. For Elizabeth and Zechariah in today's story, for the people who were listening to this Gospel of Luke, they lived in the presence of war. Some of them lived in the shadow of the destroyed temple, and they suffered indignities every day because they lived under occupation rule. So I imagine they would not feel as if the promises of God had already been fulfilled. They were waiting. And still, Zechariah's song announces that God is trustworthy and that the promises of God will be fulfilled. And that fulfillment that is coming, that realization of what is going to be, is an invitation to live as if it is already fulfilled. So then from that position, Zechariah blesses John, gives a vocation to go and prepare people to live into the already not yet, the fulfillment of God's promises. John is given responsibility to help people repent so that they too can see how God's breaking into our world. So we, too, are invited to see the fulfillment of God's promises as an invitation to live as if it's already true now. We don't have to wait. We can live like it is already here now. We can live now as if God's vision for the world is already realized. Because ultimately, we don't hope in human systems here on earth. Instead, we hope in God, who shows up in promises, in new life, in unexpected surprises, in turns in the road. Those are the places where God shows up. And ultimately, we don't despair at the presence of war or the destruction of sacred places in our world or in the daily indignities of living under discriminating rules and oppression. Those things happen, but we don't despair because God has freed our ancestors in faith. God is freeing us today, and God will continue to free our descendants in faith. So we are invited today and every day to live as if the already not yet is here. To look at the world and to see our neighbors as God sees those things. A world where God's fullness is already shining in those places of darkness, where God's fullness is already present with those who are sitting in the shadow of death, where God's fullness then is showing us the way, one footstep at a time, showing us the way of peace. And so, for the rest of this worship service, for this afternoon and this coming week, it is my prayer that you will live as somebody who has salvation. You have salvation. We are freed to live as if all of God's promises are already fulfilled. Because they already have been, just not yet.